Welcome to Human Risk, a podcast dedicated to the understanding of human behaviour as a risk. Here's your host, Christian Hunt.
Hello and welcome back to the Human Risk podcast. On this episode, I'm exploring a concept that is central to the idea behind the show. I originally coined the term human risk when I was working in compliance and risk in a bank. At that time, there was a lot of focus on technology and how things like machine learning, artificial intelligence and robotics could help manage risk. But it was also very clear to me that we shouldn't ignore people as a driver of risk. Because when things went wrong, and of course they did, there was a human involved at some level, either causing the problem in the first place or making it worse by the way in which they reacted to it. I wanted a term that captured the concept of people as a driver of risk. So I came up with human risk, a phrase I liked so much that it became the name of my company. More on that at human-risk.com. So obviously I needed to explain to people what the term meant in more detail, which is when I came up with the definition of the risk of people doing things they shouldn't or not doing things they should. The idea being to capture every aspect of risk caused by human decision making, everything from intentional wrongdoing to honest mistakes. Now, often when we think of risk, we think of it as people taking risk and action. I can't, people sometimes think, be held responsible for something I haven't done. Wrong, of course, when that thing is important. It is perfectly possible to take risk by doing nothing, which is what the second part of the definition is all about. Human risk isn't just about the risk of people doing things they shouldn't. It's also about the risk of people not doing things they should. And that's what this episode is all about. Joining me to discuss it is Dr. Johannes Lohse. He's one of the authors of some new research that explores whether risk-taking depends on whether risks result from an action, active risk-taking, or from not taking action, passive risk-taking. So it's about as human risk-related as it gets. So without further ado, please enjoy my conversation with Dr. Johannes Lohse. Johannes, welcome to the Human Risk podcast.
Yeah, thanks for having me. That's a great opportunity to talk to you about human risk, and it sounds really interesting.
Well, look, it's great to have you here. And I think before we dive into the piece of research and the field of study that has really fascinated and grabbed my attention, can you just give my listeners a little bit of a sense of who you are, your area of specialism, and I guess what interests you in it?
Okay, so I currently work as an assistant professor at the University of Birmingham, and I'm a behavioral economist. So I study human decision making with a focus on two areas, basically. One area is cooperation, which we will not talk a lot about today. The other area is risk, and that's probably the focus of our conversation today. And I also have a background in environmental economics, so I'm interested in why people take risks that relate to the environment. We might be able to talk about this a little bit later on.
Fantastic. And the piece of research that I came across that just excited me, because it spoke to me hugely on a human risk basis, looked at this idea of active risk-taking and passive risk-taking. I wonder, can you just explain what the difference between the two things is?
Oh, sure. So if we think about risk-taking, it's already in the word. Basically, it's taking a risk. So people make an active decision. For example, I decide to invest in a certain stock, or I decide to do a certain action, and that involves risk. But there's a different side to it, right? So you can also think about risk-taking as not taking an action. And not taking an action means I'm refraining from doing something. And by refraining from doing something, I still expose myself to a certain kind of risk. And I think this is the basic difference between these two concepts.
I mean, it is fascinating. As I looked at sort of building this sort of human risk concept, there were so many examples of people making a natural presumption that if you don't do something, you can't be held responsible for it. So, I just left things the way they were. So it's not my fault. And as you rightly point out, that is, it's not a case of one of these things is you consciously taking a risky decision, i.e. potentially bad, and the other one is totally safe. And yet we have that inbuilt presumption. We all kind of do it, which is, we walk away from things, we don't take decisions, and that is a risk decision itself, yet we don't seem to appreciate them.
Yeah, it even goes down, if you think about the legal perspective of that, so it even goes down to this feature that you're not supposed to do harm, so that would be active risk-taking. But this is seen very differently, basically, from a question of whether you basically have to help another person passively, right? And this is, even put into a legal framework like that. And I mean, there's a lot of examples where people basically think about these concepts very differently. So if you think about COVID-19 at the moment would be a good example. So at some point, we hopefully will have a vaccine. And there are people out there who don't want to get vaccinated. So what's wrong about this decision? Well, I mean, the vaccine is probably much safer than contracting the disease. And still people feel the other way around. Why? Because one thing is an active decision. You inject yourself with a vaccine, and that feels scary, that feels risky. The other decision is exposing to yourself to an illness that is around, and that's a sort of passive decision that don't feels as risky. I think this is where people might make different decisions depending on whether they perceive a situation as an active choice environment or a passive choice environment.
And is this something that people have looked at in academic research before? Because yours was the first one I'd sort of come across, but have people looked at this idea before?
Well, there are a couple of studies on this that have looked at a particular aspect. So there are a lot of studies, for example, that try to find out why don't people get a vaccination. And that's one particular example. There are a lot of studies out there that try to find out why don't people save for retirement. And not saving for retirement is another example of passive risk taking. So I think the new thing we bring out in our study is a very general way of looking at this question. So we look at this question in a very broad way, in a sense, and say, well, there's two distinct concepts, active risk taking and passive risk taking, and what do they lead to? And I think in this general way we look at it, it hasn't been done before. I think that's the innovation we did.
I've obviously read the research, but for the benefit of my listeners, what did you find about the difference between active and passive?
Well, maybe it's good to start with the idea, well, why should we see any differences there, right? And there are two ideas out there. One idea is an idea that is quite old, and that's called omission bias. And omission bias is basically going back to these studies looking at vaccination decisions and other decisions, which basically looks at this idea of regret. So people might regret something they do actively much more than something they do passively. And for that reason, we might be drawn to take more risks passively than actively, if that's really true in all settings. So this is one of the ideas that generates basically our hypothesis, and that's basically saying that if people are more willing to accept harm if they do something passively, well, then they should also be more willing to take risks passively than actively. And if that was true, then we could see that in a nice little lab experiment that we did. And the other idea is that there's something which is called attention costs. And attention costs would be the idea that all the actions we do out there require certain attention spans in our daily lives. We have a lot to do, a lot of other things that come into our mind, and so we tend to forget things, we tend to delay things, and that all happens because of attention costs. And now to take an action requires more attention than not to take an action. And so that would basically be a second motivating theory as to why this passive versus active distinction might actually matter. And so we wanted to see whether any or both of these theories can explain what people do. So what we usually do to do that is put people into an artificial situation. So we gave them a couple of lotteries to choose from. And these lotteries work in a very simple way. It's like a coin flip lottery. So basically you have a 50-50 chance of either winning a higher amount or a lower amount. And now what we did in this first study is to change the amounts that you can win. And the way the participants could change the amounts you can win is either through an active decision, so they had to click on a button and the amounts changed, or they could simply wait in another condition. And that's this tightly controlled lab study, which basically doesn't have this concept of attention costs involved at all. So this is basically only on this concept of feeling regret. So if I make an active change to these payoffs, does this matter differently than making a passive change to these payoffs? And what we see in this very first study, which is a study with students in a computer lab, they could win a certain amount of money. And what we see that this active versus passive distinction doesn't really matter a lot in this kind of environment. And that tells us that this idea that people might basically perceive the harm of passive and active decisions differently doesn't bear out in all sorts of contexts, and especially not the context we look at. And So we thought, well, there's another important component missing here, and that's basically the attention costs. And so we went to a second study, and in the second study, what we did is we again invited people to take part in an experiment. And in this experiment, people had basically 10 days to make the decisions. And again, they could either change the payoffs to a lottery by logging into an online screen and then make a choice on there. And that would be the active way of taking risks or avoiding risks. Or again, in another condition, some students could simply change these payoffs by waiting and not taking an action. And here we see huge differences. And so that sort of tells us that this component of attention cost might be actually the more important component when it comes to this active versus passive risk-taking idea.
So in very simple terms, it's and I'll be slightly crude here, so feel free to rein me back in, but we're fundamentally lazy. Yeah. And so in order to, every decision we take costs us in terms of energy, brain capacity, opportunity cost to think about other things. And so what you're basically saying there appears to be this propensity to not have to engage with things. So it's easier for us not to engage with stuff. So that might lead us to be less likely to do that.
Yeah. That is the basic idea why we see these huge differences in the second study, but not in the first study. So in the first study, your attention span to make these changes had to be very small, right? So you had around 50 seconds to concentrate on something that is in front of you at a screen. You already decided to come to this experiment, so you're very engaged with the decision situation. But our daily lives look completely different from that, right? So we have a lot of different things to do, a lot of different things to pay attention to. It's very easy to let attention slip on certain things. And what we see is if people are lazy, or if people can't focus their attention on these risk decisions, then very easily they're ready to take these passive risks. If the situation reverses and you passively basically reduce your exposure to risk, people are also very willing to do that. So it's not only about risk taking, it's also about risk avoidance. So it's more about the general feature that we simply can't focus too much on too many things at the same time.
And so that basically tells us that if one is looking, and I'm always very conscious when I talk about these things, that there is a sort of sinister side to this, right? So you could use this for evil as well as good, but let's work on the side of using this sort of thinking for good. What that basically tells us is that there may be certain types of decisions where if we genuinely want people to reflect on all of the options rather than just diving for the default or jumping in and taking the risk, that how much time we give them or giving them a period of time could be beneficial.
Yeah, I mean, this would be one way to benefit people. The other way, and one of the ways we discuss in the paper, is this idea of reminding people, so moving them out of the passive decision mode into a more active decision mode, if we believe that this active decision may be more beneficial to them. So if you think about this idea of health screening, so we all should do some health screening some of the time in our lives, and a lot of us like to avoid that. So it's a matter of fact, right? So you have numbers like 40% of people don't go to regular medical checkups, which they should probably attend to for their own benefit. And that's a perfect example of passive risk taking, right? So they take a risk of having a serious illness and they don't want to take the cost of going to these screenings. And so there's a little bit of research out there that looks at the idea that, can we remind people to attend to these screenings? And this literature seems to suggest that reminders can help in this context, right? So you send the letter to people, and this letter might be actually beneficial to them because they actually would have wanted to attend to this screening if you asked them actively. They simply forgot about it. They simply didn't pay attention. So that would be the do right. Good side of things, I guess.
Yeah. Well, and I was struck as you were talking. I mean, and clearly it's interesting now, I think, with Corona. And, the excuses for not going for medical checkups have just increased, right? I don't want to overload the medical services. I don't want to catch coronavirus, as well as all the normal pieces. So I think it's a really interesting example at this present time around that. And it's going to be fascinating to watch what happens in terms of other health implications of the kind of lockdowns that we've had going on, which I think has probably played into the dynamic that you're talking about. But this sense of reminding people, it always fascinates me because on the one hand, I receive lots of reminders that are just deeply irritating, where I kind of go away, leave me alone. And, and there are retailers that do it. There are organizational people that do it. And so you're basically saying it can be really useful to remind people, but presumably that only works in contexts where sort of we are disposed towards thinking about the issue. If we're not, then presumably a reminder plays the way I've described it.
Oh, yeah. I completely agree. So there is also research that shows exactly this kind of irritation factor. So there's a nice paper on charitable giving, which basically looks at the question whether charities should people to remind to give again. And these reminders tend to backfire. So people simply unsubscribe and leave the donor list or don't want to give again. So they find these kinds of reminders irritating. So reminders can definitely backfire. In the medical context that I was referring to, where the costs might outweigh the benefit quite greatly, and you make that clear to people, I would be more positive that such reminders, depending on their frequency, obviously, if you remind people every 2 weeks, they might, this might basically...
or every day, right? It would be really annoying.
Might get quite annoying quite quickly, but if you do it in a reasonable way, then I think this could be a helpful tool.
When we look at the concept of active and passive, is it a clear delineation, or are there situations where there's a blurring of the two things?
Well, the basic concept, I think, is quite easy to define. What is harder to understand is the mechanisms that underlie it, or that may underlie it. So you have this idea of omission bias that I talked about before, and there's also the opposite idea of an action bias, right? And so that seems to contradict the idea of an omission bias. So this idea of an action bias basically says, well, in some situations, people actually favor the action over the omission. So this whole logic turns around, right? So normally you would say people favor the omission over the action, but there are other situations where it's the other way around. So there's studies on basically penalty kickouts, and here you have this idea that basically the goalkeeper can either jump to the left side or the right side, or he can stand in the middle. And typically what you see if you look at the data, that goalkeepers either jump too often to the left or to the right. So they're basically drawn to do an action because they feel that letting in a goal looks so much worse if they just stand in the middle and do nothing, right? And so here you would have a tendency to actually act instead of not act, very contrary to what we find in our study. So there are blurring. So there are certainly mechanisms at work that might contradict or might counteract what we find in our study, and it might be quite situationally dependent. So our study is a very general study that looks at abstract lotteries chosen among students, which might be very different from a concrete example that you could be looking at.
Right, and I love the goalkeeper example. I think is a brilliant one. And so for listeners that haven't heard this is basically the idea that if you're a goalie in say football, soccer, for my American listeners, that you are better off to look like you've done something. Standing in the middle of the goal makes it look like you're lazy and stupid, whereas actually that might statistically be the best place for you to be. But you want to look like you made a call, and so you'd rather almost you lower the probability of saving the goal by diving one way or the other, but you increase the sort of defensiveness of the decision making.
Exactly. That's exactly the point, yeah.
Have you looked into at all the idea of narratives that we provide for why we went one way or the other? Is this something you explored in your experiments as to what people's justification for taking the course of action was?
Not really. It's a really interesting idea. I think because we remain so much in the abstract in this setting, people couldn't construct so clear narratives. If you went for a concrete example, so another example that motivated this study was this idea of climate change. So you have this idea of climate change, which is basically a risk that is constantly being taken on a very large scale by society by do nothing. We don't want to change our behaviors, and so the climate change risk just goes up. And around 10 years ago, scientists came up with this idea of geoengineering. And geoengineering is basically an active intervention into the climate system. So you try to remove CO2 from the atmosphere, or you try to do actions that basically alter the carbon content of the atmosphere or do something along these lines actively. And suddenly people were very worried about the risks that we are taking in that way. So they're not worried at all about the risks they're taking by letting climate change advance. But suddenly people get very worried about the active risk-taking of some of the measures that we're proposing to do something about climate change. And that sort of got me started on thinking about this problem of active and passive risk taking, because I thought, well, this is very weird how people perceive one set of risks as very grave and another set of risks as not so grave, even though they don't know much about the probabilities and the damages involved in both of these decisions. So it seems to be more about how we are taking these risks, not so much about the payoffs or the costs of these risks.
Right, and it's fascinating to me because what you've alighted on here is this idea that we are not very good as a species at assessing risk.
Yeah,
we build structures around it, and some of the decisions make perfect sense when you understand the context in which they're taken. But if we look at it sort of from a theoretical perspective, we don't, I guess this is an argument that says we're not Homo economicus.
Probably. I mean, all these bias arguments, in a sense, are arguments that we are not acting according to these simple models that we as economists like to work with, because they work well, right, on a theoretical basis, but they don't describe human behavior very well in some instances. And I think if you talk about this topic of assessing risks, I mean, we're terrible at this. I mean, if you look back at this whole research area of risk, I mean, 40 years of research showing that people are very bad at basically understanding basic risks of their actions, or basic risks of certain situations. You can see that also in regulation, which probably is something your listeners are interested in. So what kinds of risks are being heavily regulated? What kinds of risks are basically not so heavily regulated might also depend on how dreadful these risks seem. So if you think about environmental economics, you have certain risks that come from the environment that seem very dreadful, and we try to prevent these a lot. And there are other risks like air pollution that might kill much more people, but they don't seem very dreadful because they're sort of hidden, and we do not enough to regulate these risks, right? Right.
It always strikes me that the one example I always cite to people is that you get those ludicrous warnings on coffee cups that tell you, the contents may be hot, or there's that McDonald's, the hot apple pie, the clue's in the name, and yet they go contents may be hot because of the legal risk. And so you get this weird bit of sort of risk management that's got nothing to do with the ultimate. The majority of people, when they've ordered a cup of coffee, are going to work out it's hot.
Yeah,
right?
exactly.
So you're not actually protecting yourself from people reading it and going, I must remember this is hot. You're protecting yourself from the legal threat, which is sort of so far removed from the actual thing you're pretending to protect yourself with. So I think there's an interesting thing around, as you say, is the visibility of risks, but also often the thing that we pretend we're protecting ourselves from is legal risk or reputational risk or something else, rather than the actual underlying risk that's there.
Yeah, exactly. And I think, the legal risk is one aspect of it, and I think the other one are public demands to regulate certain risks, and the public might have certain views on risks that are very obvious. So aviation is an industry that is perceived as being very risky, even though it's not as risky as driving around in your car. And still people want you to put in a lot of regulation to make aviation safer, and less so when they talk about their own cars, right? And that's a misconception of basic risks to travel from A to B. And there's this very nice old study after September 11 that you probably have talked on this program before, right? So there's basically this idea that after September 11, this risk perception of people of flying just got even worse, and they thought flying is a terrible idea. So they basically instead started driving long distances and had a lot of car accidents, and unfortunately more people died doing that than in the 9/11 attacks. So you can see how certain events can skew our understanding of basic risk.
Right, and it's an interesting example of the action bias, as you say, because I'm not going to get on those dangerous planes, and I will, to use a phrase that we've heard far too much here in the UK, I'm taking back control, right? And I'm gonna drive myself, because then I can manage the risks better, and I'm in my little box. And of course, as you point out, statistically, generally airline pilots are safer at getting us through the skies than we are navigating ourselves our own little boxes on the ground. And there's a really interesting example of sort of not understanding what we take. And that makes me think about, the concept of passive risk, because as you say, one of the interesting things is active risk. We kind of, we think we know we're taking. Mm-hmm. Passive risk is by definition, we're often not aware that we're doing it, either because we choose not to be aware, or maybe we're genuinely not aware. Yeah. And that's quite an interesting, fundamental difference between the two things.
Yeah, and I completely agree. So for many of the examples that motivated this study that we were doing, this is exactly the case, right? So you're not saving for retirement. You're not even perceiving that as a risky decision, right? So you're not perceiving it as a decision at all, maybe, right? So it's simply out of your mind at the moment that you should be doing that. And yeah, so I think in many situations of passive risk taking, people are not even aware of the risk they currently are taking by doing what they're not doing, right?
Which of course can be a good thing, because if we were fully cognizant of all the risks that we were taking, I would do all kinds, we wouldn't, there lots of things wouldn't happen. And we wouldn't, so we would be, I'm always struck by, so I ride motorbikes. And one of the things, if you look, technically speaking, I am supposed, before I get on my bike, I'm supposed to do lots of checks. Supposed to do tire pressure and this, that, everything else. Now, if I'm doing a long journey or I haven't ridden it for ages, then I will. But if I'm just regularly riding, am I going to look each time? I can pretend that I do. And clearly, if I had an incident, my insurance company would be asking those questions and I might answer them in a certain way. It would act as friction in many cases if we were to be fully aware of all the passive risk that we're taking.
Yeah, I mean, of course, you could think that would make people overcautious. I mean, I think what we're all about is that the mode of choice by which you're taking risk should not influence whether you are willing to take this specific risk. So if this passive way of taking risks has the same probability of leading to harm than an active risk, then you should either be willing to take both of these risks or you should be willing to not take both of these risks. But what we see in our experiments is that the pure mode of choice by which you're basically selecting one thing or the other influences what you're doing. And that's sort of the irrationality that we point at. So I agree, of course, if we were fully aware of all the risks we're taking, then we might not be willing to take these risks, but that might be perfectly fine if we're a cautious person, right?
Right.
So it depends, or what I'm more interested in is basically these inconsistencies that can arise if people take very large risks passively that they would never be willing to take actively, and I think this is the inconsistency. So the not being aware of potentially very large risks that I would never be willing to bet on actively, right?
Right. So part of the trick here, then, back to my using behavioral science for good mentality, is to spend a little bit of time, if one wants people to think about things differently, is you have to make them aware of the passive risk that they're taking. And therefore shining a spotlight on that becomes critically important because they're not going to work it out for themselves.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, this is already this idea of reminders, or this idea of information that can help people being more aware of the passive risk they're taking. And I think, the health domain is a perfect, source of examples. Not going to your checkups, that could be a very large risk that you're taking, a much larger risk than, say, getting a prescribed medicine, being willing to take that actively, right? And that might be a very small risk decision that you're perfectly happy to take. But then at the same time, you're not willing to do a small thing that might prevent a potentially very large risk to your health. And I think this is the thing where you need to help people make this decision better by informing them or by making them aware of the dangers of not taking decisions.
But it's very interesting though when you think about that idea that people don't know and providing them with information and you've highlighted reminders as a sort of and reminding has got the re in it, so in theory we already know it, so we're just being told it again. It's fascinating when you look at something like cigarettes or alcohol, where the medical profession has put, or at least the health authorities. Let's not bring the medical profession into it. Many of whom enjoy a drink or two, and smoking as well, interestingly. But if you look at that, the whole philosophy around smoking and drinking has been, we will highlight the risk that you are taking. So we start off by saying, with words like we put words on the packaging that says smoking can kill. And then we go a little bit further and we put pictures of lungs and other deformities on there to scare the hell out of people so it looks unappealing. But we know that those are probably not as effective as some of the other things like removing cigarette advertising from sports and other pieces, making it harder for people to buy cigarettes by having ID checks or hiding them away. In the UK, you have to specifically request them. You can't just help yourself on the shelf. And so there's an interesting thing here that says giving people information doesn't always seem to be as effective as some of these other measures. And yet it's something, again, it feels like a sort of defensible thing. Well, we told you.
Yeah.
And I'm intrigued as to your thoughts around that dynamic because, clearly we're back to sort of the reminder works if you're minded to do it anyway.
Yeah, I mean, I think here we're in a domain where people don't need to be reminded in a sense that smoking is harmful. This is something and you willingly accept. I mean, we also have to consider that especially smoking is quite addictive. So I think we can't really treat these decisions similar to decisions on non-addictive things, right? So smoking might be an example where people actually would like to quit, but they find it very hard to do so, and so they're not really willingly still taking these risks, or at least you might be worried that they're not still willingly taking these risks. So the question is, how would you optimally, keep people from exposing themselves to this risk? And I think probably you would have to start with the starting to smoking, right? I think this is an area where people might still be uninformed. If you think about younger people, or if you think about teenagers, they might not really understand the long-term implications of this choice. And so here information might help more than if you target this information to long-term smokers who probably have a habit of smoking, who are addicted, and who, might not really learn anything new from the information you're giving them, right?
Right, and it becomes, actually, these reminders just become irritating, or you react against them, right? Who are you end up in the sort of, who are you to tell me what to do, get stuffed, and actually provoking the opposite reaction. It's interesting when you were talking about smoking, because so I had Professor Robert Frank on the podcast, and he was talking about behavioral contagion, and so, the biggest indicator as to whether you will smoke is to do with whether your friends smoke.
Yeah.
So getting it at the source is probably a much more effective way of dealing with it, rather than trying to catch it later on when it's, as you say, it's an ingrained habit.
Yeah, exactly. So they're peer effects, right? So and I think, you see that smoking is going down in many Western countries, right? It's not something that is basically rising, and I think one of the reasons why it's going down is because it, is getting out of fashion, if you can say that, right? So younger people don't see it as a fashionable choice anymore, and how that happened is probably that it was not presented as a fashionable choice to them anymore in movies or in these kinds of environments, and so it's less interesting for them to start this habit.
Yeah, no, I was thinking back actually as I was growing up. I'm probably showing my age here, but you're right. There was kind of the James Dean, Marilyn Monroe, people like that used to smoke. I'm not quite that old, but I remember those movies. But yeah, you're right. It's less prevalent now for obvious reasons. And I was thinking about this concept of reminders, and again, thinking about how my audience can start to reflect on some of this in the work that some of them do around this piece. And you've basically sort of said, one of the ways that we can get people to be more aware is we'll remind them that they're making these choices. So we'll keep sort of nudging them, for want of a better phrase, to think about that. Do you think it is literally a case of having to reactivate the brain and go, hey, you should be focusing on this? Or is there a sense that you have to mix it up a bit? So you need to have different messages because there'll be some form of behavioral fatigue around it. So in other words, is it just sort of bringing it back into the spotlight? Or do we have to sort of emotionally engage and kind of, is it more of an emotional decision than just a sort of switching on, switching off of memory or awareness?
Well, this is nothing our study really looks at, so I would have to speculate a bit. So I think
I love getting researchers to speculate, because it takes those. Well, I have to be very careful here. It's a flight of fancy, and I recognise that. I'm not asking you to sort of stretch the bounds of your study, but I'm just intrigued as to what you think based on what you've seen.
Well, I guess as you were saying earlier as well, so these reminders can probably wear off. So that would be the behavioral fatigue, right? So if you get a letter each month saying, well, you should really save for your retirement now, how much good will this do? But I think it still might help to refocus attention. I think there's quite an interesting study on these attention costs out there on a federal program that would help poor people to do some renovation work on their houses, and this is basically a large stakes study, so that would help them get a couple of $1,000 if I remember correctly. So in this study they had basically 4 different groups of people. So one group of people were basically looked at and they simply knew about the program. Another group of people was informed about the group program. A third group of people was basically a researcher came to their house and helped them fill the application. And the fourth group was basically the researcher even did the next step, folded the application, put it into an envelope and put a stamp on it, and then left it at their house and say, well, you have to still post it. And even in this very last group where people basically were helped along their decision quite some way, up to the point where they only had to post a letter. Even there, you had quite a significant fraction of these people not doing this last step. And this just illustrates that even for large stakes decisions that we sometimes make, our attention can get in our way, right? So they would have get a quite high or significant benefit from this action, and still they were not, ready to walk to the post box and just post this letter, right? And that says
right.
that, reminders can get you some of the way, but then our, limited attention span might, get in the way again. And other, daily chores, daily troubles might get into the way.
And I think it's really funny when you talk about things that are obviously in our interest, big decisions. And it always amuses me because sort of often I find myself putting more effort into choosing a sandwich than I do taking bigger picture decisions. So where do we go next from here? So you've alighted on this distinction in the way that where's your study gonna sort of take you next in terms of what you want to explore in this topic?
Yeah, so I think with every scientific study, so the first thing that will happen now is under review at the moment. So people will look at it, and only then we can be really sure that what we find is actually scientifically valid. So this is the process we're at now. In terms of questions that come out of it, I think one of the questions we thought about, looking at ourselves would be to really look at things like reminders in this kind of setting, right? So we have only proposed that as a policy, basically saying, well, based on what we see in terms of behavior in this study, that might be an interesting route to go down. And I think that would be a logical next step to really test if such reminders or reframing. So that would be another area that we wanted to look at. So basically this idea, can you basically reframe an active decision environment into a passive decision environment or not? So this was something we were discussing quite some bit when we were basically trying to find examples in our study. So if you think, for example, about the stock market, is this an environment where people take active decisions to invest or not invest, or is this an environment where people take passive decisions? And I think there's those types of investors out there. So there are people out there that buy a stock and then forget about it for 20 years and then are either delighted or shocked what has happened with this stock, right? And there are people who constantly check basically how their stocks are doing and then recalibrate their portfolio. So what we know from other papers is that these people who constantly need to recalibrate their portfolio, they often make errors and they often basically come out worse than the people who let their investments sit for a certain time. And I think if you think about this topic of passive risk taking, if you let something sit for quite some time, this might be considered passive risk taking, but at the same time it might be a beneficial kind of passive risk taking. So there can be definitely situations where you want people to take less actions, and here you try to basically reverse what I was saying before. So here you would basically try to basically get people to look less at their portfolio, to look less at how their stocks are doing, and just look once every few months and not look every day and see whether you can maybe. Right.
So from a behavioral perspective, so it's easy to see to turn passive into active. Mm-hmm. You'd be looking at reminders and kind of shining a light on things, but to turn active into passive, you'd put in kind of friction. Exactly. Make it harder for people to, I don't know, as you say, make it difficult to log into that particular website, or make it slower, or whatever.
Yeah, I think Cass Sunstein has a term for that now. It's called sludge, right? So it's the opposite of a nudge. So it's basically making it harder to do things, even though sludge often is used in a mischievous way. But yeah.
Right. Yeah. I mean, I'd always thought about that in the context of those companies that make it really hard to cancel subscriptions.
Exactly.
You could one click to subscribe, write a letter and send in your grandmother's DNA and a load of other things to unsubscribe.
Exactly.
And it's interesting, actually, as you were talking, so one of the things that I was looking at when I worked financial services was, even where you've got, if you look at fund management and where fund managers get their information from. So, fund managers, in theory, I'm talking sort of the active end of funds. I mean, literally using active and passive in the sense of investment funds. And one of the things that was interesting is when you start to look and say, where are those people making the active decisions getting their information from. And it was really fascinating because obviously they would say, well, we have access to all this research and data. But of course, there's interesting frictions and biases around how they use that data. So there are lots of examples where, well, I read research from these, I get research from these houses, but actually I can't remember and it's literally as simple as I can't remember the login for this one, or that person's an idiot, so I'm not going to listen to them, but I trust this person. And so what they were doing was funneling the data that they were using to make their active decision through a number of different lenses, some of which were practical, some of which were cognitive. And therefore, actually, even when you looked at something like that, you would say they are not being as active as they might think they're being, because in many respects, they are being passive in parts of the active decision making. And so one of the things we were looking at is to say, can you create a kind of Netflix or Spotify type portal where all the research in whatever form, whether it's video or text or audio, comes in and it's presented to you in a manner that makes it equally accessible and easy for you to get to. And you can start to play with things in the background and say, you haven't read this research. You haven't read anything by these people, or this is contrarian, you should have a look at this, and try and work out how to present those different pieces. Because even when we think we're being active, there are elements of the decision-making process that are passive, because we can't do all of the research in the world for every single thing. So we're going to have to be passive in some respects.
Yeah, I completely agree. And I think this really goes into a project I'm working on at the moment, where we look at what type of information do people actually access to make decisions. And we look at settings where they basically, are simply presented pieces of information without having a choice in them. And then we compare that to settings where people have to make active decisions, whom to trust in a sense, right? And there we see quite interesting biases in information acquisition. So you have this idea of outsiders and insiders. So you have basically people who are from your in-group and people who are from an out-group. And sometimes these, out-group information pieces are very heavily discounted or ignored, even though you sort of know that it is objectively a more accurate source. You have some accuracy score that we show to people. At the same time, we show to them that this is a member of some other group you don't belong to, and you discount this piece of information in favor of a piece of information that comes basically from an in-group member, but is far less accurate in an objective sense, right? And that is, I think, an interesting way of thinking about information acquisition, and goes into what you were saying, right? So we make choices about which pieces of information we select, and we are not always smart about how we make these selections of information acquisition.
Which then could be used to blur to either shift the frame to move active to passive, or you do get into this blurring that I was kind of pointing out, and sort of, I'm always struck by those experiments that they do where you give people quotes or positions on something, and you tell them that it's politician A who they detest, and magically it's the worst idea they've ever heard. And if you flip it and say it was politician B, oh, that's incredible, it's the right, and it's this tribalism that we're seeing quite a lot of. But I think there's some really interesting food for thought there around saying, we can change a perception of what is an active choice, might not in reality be an active choice or a passive choice. We are bringing lots of things to bear that, on the face of it, many decisions that we make, we sort of or don't take. This labeling of binary of active and passive seems like a binary thing. But actually, from what you've been saying there, there's quite a lot of blurring there, because it depends on what data we're using to make that decision, or avoid making that decision.
Oh yeah, definitely, yeah. No, I fully agree that basically even an active choice might not draw on the full set of information that is out there in the world, because we're simply overloaded, and so we selectively pick certain pieces of information, ignore others, making it basically an active choice with some passive elements, I think, would be a description. Right. Yeah.
How has this changed the way you go about your own life? Are you spending more time thinking about your sort of active and passive choices, or have you just sort of recognised that that's a bit too hard and therefore I just do whatever was there?
I think it's a really nice question. I think the hard thing about these passive risks is often that we don't realise that we're actually taking them, and so even if I wanted to change how I'm going about my own life, I might not always be successful in doing so, right? So I think, it's also a nice question, because if you think about, behavioral economics as the thing I do for the last 10 years, and, you learn about a lot of biases in human behavior, but then still you realize yourself doing all of these things all the time as well, right? So even if you know about a certain bias, it's really hard to bring yourself to avoid it, right? So even
and you've got less excuse as well, right?
So I think this is, if you have a reflective moment, you think, yeah, this is exactly what I'm doing, right? And then you realize that even experts or even people who devote their life studying these kinds of things will fall into the same traps as everybody else, because this is how our mind works, I guess, and we can't avoid, falling in the same traps as everybody else.
Right. Yeah. Well, otherwise it would be weird, because you would learn this stuff and then you would become a sort of superhuman. And it was, and the reason I asked the question is I think it's fascinating as I was reading the research and sort of, contemplating how recognizing that there's a hell of a lot of more things you want to study and look at and explore, and context matters hugely. But, there are some interesting things here when one looks at controlling one's own sort of environment thinking, but also if one's in a kind of compliance or risk role, controlling other people's, how one goes about thinking about these things could have major impact on how you mitigate risk or maximize human capital. And so I was just fascinated to the extent that sort of, if you'd spotted any easy tricks for this thing, or if it really, all it's doing is shining a light on, this is a damn sight more complicated than we might originally have thought.
Yeah, I mean, I think I'm siding with the latter. It is quite complicated. I think the important question is if you are a person who is basically actively creating decision environments, which probably if you work in industry and you have a couple of people working in a team and you want to avoid these people falling into these behavioral traps or into these passive decision modes, then there's certain things you can do, as we were discussing, right? You can basically try to point out to them that, there's certain other decisions you're making in your daily practice that actually involve risk, and are you willing to take these risks or not? Are you willing to take these risks for a firm? In your private life, I mean, obviously, if you get into a reflective mode, you might, spot these things as well. But then I think if you go about your daily business, you're very quick to forget them as well. So probably, if you make major decisions, I think you should probably try to think about, what kind of passive risks am I taking by making this specific decision, and not only the active risks. So say you're buying a house or something like that, or you're buying a car. This would be larger investment decisions where you might try to ask yourself, well.
And we come back to kind of perceived wisdom, right? Because you get these classic sort of phrases or sayings that contain quite a lot of wisdom. So, this idea of sleeping on something, I think is really interesting, because you've basically, if I look at financial services and the concept of a cooling off period. So regulators build in this thing, recognizing that you might have been suckered into or think, you might think you're doing the right thing, but you may need time to reflect on the decision you made, a mortgage you signed up to, insurance product you've bought. And so they artificially create this period of time where you're allowed to unwind. And that sits neatly in the idea of sort of, sleep on it. Give it some thought. Don't just dive into this thing because your first reaction is likely to be there. And so actually, you can turn something that's a great example of something that might have, it's active from a legal perspective because you have signed something, but it's very passive from a decision-making perspective because you've kind of, particularly if you signed up to buy a product from a highly regulated, highly respected organization, well, they wouldn't be allowed to sell me stupid products, and I've been advised that it's a good thing, it seems like a really good idea, and I just want to get this done, so I'll sign. So legally, you've taken an active decision. Morally and practically, you've taken quite a passive decision, and there are more passive elements. So you factor this thing in that says, let's buy a little bit more time. And so there's an interesting example, I think, of how this might work in reality, where you can sort of say, look, we build some of these things in that doesn't sort of consciously flip it from being one thing to another, but it sort of reframes it to allow people, because if you've made the right decision, you're no worse off. But if you haven't, I've bought you a window. Yeah,
no, it sounds like a very, very good tool to prevent people from making very bad decisions, right? So I think that's a good example.
I mean, you don't want to do it for everything, right? It's the flip side, because that sort of becomes a bit ridiculous. And there is something around choice overload as well. I'm thinking back on the famous experiment with jams, where, again, for listeners that haven't heard this, this is the idea. They conducted various experiments. We tend to think that more choice is a good thing, but they did an experiment with jams in a supermarket and presented lots. And actually, if you presented people with too much choice, they just gave up because it was too difficult, so they bought less jam. So having a smaller selection, ironically, sells more jam than a bigger selection. And this is this idea of sort of choice overload. Is that something you've thought about in terms of sort of, why we might be more passive, that we just can't cope with this, is too much, and so it's just easier not to think about it?
Yeah, I mean, this might definitely be a source of attention costs, right? So if you present people with a lot of things to think about, then focusing your attention on one particular aspect is becoming harder and harder. And so this might create situations where you're then passively accepting certain risks simply for the fact that you're not really thinking about them because you think about all the other options that have been presented to you. So yeah, that's definitely a feature.
And then the final bit I wanted to pick up on is, and I sort of alluded to it just before, is, and I guess there's coronavirus is probably a really good example of this. We've steered fairly clear of coronavirus with one couple of exceptions, but let's get back in on that. There is an interesting thing here where we can be encouraged to be passive around things by somebody else kind of setting the parameters. And you see this a lot with regulation and the law. And so if I think about, for example, here in the UK, we've got this 2 meter, stay 2 meters away from someone. And it's kind of presented as if it's hard science that says 2 meters is the 1 meter 99, highly dangerous, 2 meters 1, very safe. And of course, that's not the way it operates, but it's a sort of proxy to allow people to manage the situation. But there's, speed limits be another one where it's sort of, as long as I'm traveling within the speed limit, I'm okay. Which, of course, might be complete nonsense both ways. It might be nonsense in that the speed limit may be far too low and you could actually afford to go faster. Maybe you're Lewis Hamilton or something. Or for some people, that speed limit can be way too high, right? You should not be driving, or the road conditions or whatever. And so there's this interesting piece where we are turned into, often we can sort of abdicate decision-making responsibility, i.e. make it a passive decision because we point to a law or a rule or somebody else's thinking around that, and that's not desperately intelligent. No, that's quite dangerous from a risk.
I mean, this is exactly the point. I mean, I think you've seen this very well now that certain aspects of this lockdown rules have been eased in Germany, and suddenly people have taken that as an invitation to do exactly what has been allowed, right? So the restaurants open and everybody feels like they really have to go to a restaurant right now. So just because it has become legal now, people misperceive that as it has become non-risky to do so. And that might be a completely different aspect, right? So as you were saying, right? So the point that something has basically, a maximum speed limit shouldn't prevent you from driving more slowly if you feel like that will be an active risk management strategy or active way of minimizing your risk, right? So yeah, I've been observing this for the last 2-3 weeks when, Germany has come out of this strict lockdown and suddenly people, just because it's now legally allowed to do a lot of things, they certainly feel like they have to do them. And that seems like a bad risk management strategy for some people, especially if you're older or if you have some kind of vulnerabilities. It shouldn't invite you to suddenly do a lot of these things that people are now suddenly doing again.
Right. I always use the phrase "just because you can" doesn't mean you should, as a sort of again as a short phrase that sort of has quite a lot of wisdom in it, which is sort of think about these things and decide whether it's the right thing to do. But I think there is something, as you say, in the somebody else has done the thinking, so I can be lazy here. I can turn into passive choice because I will just lever off their thinking. So somebody smart in the government must have worked out that scientists will have worked out it's okay. So we'll just do what the scientists say because then I don't have to think about it.
Exactly. Yeah.
And actually, we're required. And so there's an interesting thing here around a lot of regulation and instructions create a passivity in the target audience where actually it is active thinking within that context that's required if you really want to mitigate the risk.
Yeah. No, I completely agree. I mean, another example would be all the rules around, once I've signed a document, I'm allowed to buy options or stocks and all these kinds of things at the stock market. And then I've basically signed a document telling that I fully understand the risks, and it might tell people, well, once I signed a document, these actions have become riskless because somebody has informed me about them. But all this has done is basically a minimum legal requirement so that everybody knows that I know the risks that I'm taking, and I always found that a little bit strange as well.
Right, and there was interesting out there I was reading this morning around diversity training and anti-bias training, and obviously with those topics being hot in the news. And one of the challenges of those is that people is the idea of moral licensing. So, if again listeners who aren't aware, if you've done something good, you're allowed to do something bad. We kind of run a sort of moral account in our heads, and so it was saying there that basically you'd been on this training course. And actually, there were plenty of examples of people. Well, I have been on the training course, and therefore I am now I've de-biased myself. And I'm okay to do what the hell I want because if I hadn't been on the training course, I wouldn't do this. And so there's a really interesting thing, I think, around our perception of pieces. And that seems to me to be relevant to your field of study, where we literally switch off the thing because we take a cue from the wrong place. We take the wrong cue.
Yeah, no, I completely agree.
Look, is there anything else that we should have covered that you think is worth sharing with listeners? Because I'm conscious that there's a heck of a lot of avenues that we could go down, and often in this podcast,
I think,
meander down.
Yeah, I think we pretty much covered most of the important bits and pieces, I guess.
Fabulous stuff. Well, look, firstly, thank you for doing the research and publishing it, because it was genuinely struck a chord with me, given my definition of human risk. And thank you so much for coming on the podcast to explain it. I think this is a really interesting field of study. So I will put links to the research and to your webpage in the show notes so people can dive in and find out more. And look, I'd love to stay in touch with you and get you back as you explore this fascinating topic, because I think it's super relevant to many of the topics that I'm looking at and my listeners are looking at. So thank you for all of those things, and thank you for being on the podcast.
Yeah, thank you very much for having me. So that was a great experience, my first podcast, to be honest. So that was great.
Fabulous. Seasoned professional already. You've been a great guest. Thank you so much.
Okay, thank you very much.
So that's it for another episode of the Human Risk Podcast. My massive thanks to Johannes for appearing and to you for listening. If you're interested in reading Johannes's research, you'll find a link to that in the show notes, together with a link to his website where you can find out more about his area of specialism. If this is your first time listening to the Human Risk Podcast, welcome. You can subscribe to it wherever you get your quality audio content. It's available on all of the platforms. Listeners who've enjoyed the show and have the opportunity to leave a review on their platform of choice would be hugely appreciated. It really does make a difference, allows people to find the show and me to continue to attract the kind of high quality guests I've managed so far. I will be back with another episode of this podcast very soon. But if you're missing human risk content and interested in more, do check out the Human Risk newsletter and video channel. Links to both of those at human-risk.com. Thank you so much for listening. Stay safe, whether you're taking active or passive risk. And thanks again for listening.